Welcome to Mystery Stories, a quiet place where small villages hide long memories and ordinary lives carry extraordinary secrets. Tonight's story unfolds gently, through polite smiles, careful words, and truths written where few think to look. Listen closely, because in places like this, nothing happens by accident. And even the calmest moments can conceal the beginning of something deeply unsettling. Chapter 1. The gossip began before the doors of the church hall were fully open, which in St. Maron was usually a sign that something out of the ordinary had already happened. Miss Marple heard it first, not as a sentence, but as a pause, a soft hesitation between polite words, as two ladies in sensible coats stood just inside the doorway, pretending to admire a table of donated novels. One of them leaned closer than necessary and murmured that the book had been there yesterday and was not quite the same today. Miss Marple paused at the threshold with her handbag resting lightly against her wrist and allowed herself a moment to listen before stepping fully inside. The charity book sale was meant to be a cheerful affair. The vicar had insisted on bunting. The trestle tables were draped in floral cloths that had seen many such events. The air carried the comforting mingled scents of paper sponge cake and weak tea. Yet Miss Marple noticed at once that people were not browsing in their usual absent-minded way. Instead, there was a subtle pattern to their movements. Several villagers drifted repeatedly toward one particular table, and then away again as though uncertain how close they wished to be seen. Miss Marple followed the pattern without appearing to do so. She stopped to greet Mrs. Phipps the florist, and commented kindly on the roses arranged by the donation tin. She remarked on the weather to Sir Giles, who was pretending to examine a shelf of travel books while watching the room. Only then did she allow herself to stand before the table that had become the quiet center of attention. The book lay there among other worthy but dull volumes, its spine a little more worn, its binding heavier. It was a local history ledger, though, bound in leather like a respectable novel, and its title was stamped in faded gold. Miss Marple did not touch it at once. She leaned slightly forward and breathed in. The scent reached her immediately, smoke faint but unmistakable, and beneath it, lavender the sort used in linen cupboards and nowhere else. It was not a smell one associated with church halls or public shelves. Behind her, she felt rather than heard someone approach. Mrs. Linton came to stand beside her, smoothing the front of her cardigan with careful fingers. When Miss Marple mentioned the title in a mild conversational tone, Mrs. Linton paused. It was only a moment, but in that moment, her teacup, which she had been carrying since entering the hall, touched its saucer with a small, clear clink. She smiled at once and spoke of the weather, but Miss Marple had already noticed the tremor. A young man hurried toward them, his expression earnest and a little flushed. Peter Hargreaves had only recently taken up his position as clerk to the parish council, and still carried his responsibilities like a garment that did not quite fit. He insisted politely but firmly that the book had been complete the previous afternoon. He had helped arrange the tables himself and remembered the weight of it when he lifted it from the box. Now when he opened it, there were clean gaps where pages should have been neat, precise cuts, as though made with a blade by someone who took care. The vicar's wife drew Miss Marple aside under the pretense of offering her a biscuit, and whispered that the missing pages were not mere history. They recorded a private donation made many years ago, one that had saved a family name from disgrace. Miss Marple thanked her and accepted the biscuit, but noted how the woman's voice dropped when she spoke, and how her eyes flicked toward Mrs. Linton, and then away again. Miss Marple finally picked up the ledger. It was heavier on one side than the other, and when she opened it, she saw the truth of Peter's words. The cuts were recent. She did not need to run her finger along the edge to know that. Instead, she tilted the book slightly and saw a pale gray dust settled deep in the inner seam, close to the binding. Old cuts yellowed and softened with time did not leave such traces. This dust was fresh. Around her, the sale continued. Someone laughed a little too loudly near the cake table. Mrs. Phipps remarked that people were being awfully secretive over old books these days. Miss Marple smiled at the comment and agreed while quietly filing it away. Gossip often dressed itself as humor in St. Maron. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple allowed herself to be drawn into small conversations. She listened to a pair of ladies debate whether the ledger should be withdrawn from sale. She noticed how one of them spoke too quickly when she insisted it was nothing of consequence. She observed how Sir Giles declined to meet her eye when Peter mentioned consulting older parish records. None of these things were proof, but they were texture, and texture mattered. She took her tea standing near the window and watched the door. Twice she saw the same newcomer pause there. Miss Evelyn Crane had arrived in the village only months before, yet already she volunteered eagerly for church events. She smiled readily and spoke charmingly, but Miss Marple noticed how her gaze returned again and again to the ledger table. When at last she approached it, she did not open the book, but rested her gloved fingers on the cover for a moment longer than necessary, as though reassuring herself of something unseen. Later, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Phipps mention that lavender had been harder to come by lately, and wondered aloud who might still be using it so freely. It was said lightly, but Miss Marple saw the way Evelyn Crane stiffened almost imperceptibly before relaxing again. A small thing, perhaps, but small things were Miss Marple's particular interest. By early afternoon, the decision was made to remove the ledger from sale. The vicar announced it with forced cheer and suggested another pot of tea. Miss Marple watched Peter carry the book carefully toward the vestry, and noted how his hands shook just slightly. Responsibility weighed heavily on the young. Before leaving, Miss Marple paused by the ledger one last time. She did not touch it again. She simply looked. The smell, the dust, the pauses in conversation, the way certain names altered the air of the room. These were not the signs of harmless curiosity. They were the signs of fear. As she stepped back into the cool air outside the church hall, Miss Marple felt the familiar, quiet certainty settle within her. A book did not lose its pages without reason. People did not handle history with such care unless it had the power to harm them. And somewhere beneath the bunting and the sponge cake and the polite smiles, something far darker had already begun to move. Miss Marple walked home at her usual unhurried pace, smiling kindly to those she passed, yet her mind was alert and watchful. The first shadow had fallen, and she knew with gentle confidence that more would soon follow. Chapter 2. It was remarkable how quickly a village could decide that a thing was either nothing at all or something so serious it must never be spoken of plainly. By the next morning, St. Maron had chosen the second. Miss Marple heard it in the soft way the baker's wife stopped mid-sentence when she saw someone approach. She heard it in the careful brightness of greetings that tried too hard to sound ordinary. And she heard it most clearly in the way people asked about the weather as though the sky might kindly change the subject for them. She went out after breakfast as she always did, not hurrying, not making a show of curiosity, carrying her handbag as though her day held only small errands. The lane toward Mrs. Linton's house was damp from an earlier mist, and the hedgerows held that quiet winter green, which made every cottage look like it had been placed there deliberately for comfort. A cat watched her from a low wall, with the calm authority of something that belonged everywhere. Mrs. Linton had invited her for tea, in the way one invited Miss Marple for many things. It was never phrased as an invitation to talk. It was phrased as an invitation to be kind, to be companionable, to sit for a little while and share a plate of biscuits. Yet beneath the politeness, Miss Marple sensed a different motive. Mrs. Linton did not wish to be alone with her own thoughts. Inside the sitting room, the fire had been laid carefully, though it was not yet lit. Sunlight fell through lace curtains onto a sofa that had been brushed to perfection. The room smelled of furniture polish, stale roses, and something faintly sharp that might have been lavender or might have been anxiety. Mrs. Linton greeted her with a smile and a little laugh that ended too quickly. They sat with tea between them. Mrs. Linton poured with a hand that looked steady until the moment she lifted the pot. Then Miss Marple saw it again, the small tremor that seemed to come and go, like a secret. The cup did not rattle this time. Mrs. Linton was prepared. That, Miss Marple thought gently, was already a kind of answer. The maid appeared with a plate of scones and jam. A young woman with neat hair and eyes that kept flicking toward the door, as if listening for footsteps outside. Each time Mrs. Linton mentioned her husband's name, even casually, the maid's hands moved at once to the sideboard. She straightened a spoon. She aligned a dish. She smoothed an invisible crease in a cloth. It was as though the name unsettled the room, and she was trying to press it back into order. Miss Marple remarked on the jam, complimenting the texture, and watched the maid's face. A tiny tightening at the corners of the mouth, quickly covered. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "How busy the church hall was yesterday," she said mildly. "It is always so nice when everyone comes together." Mrs. Linton agreed with too much enthusiasm, and spoke of the vicar's wife's efforts, the bunting, the cakes, the new volunteer, the way the tables had been arranged. Her words came smoothly until Miss Marple mentioned, as though in passing, that certain books had attracted a great deal of interest. Mrs. Linton's smile held, but something behind it shifted. Her gaze dropped to the rim of her cup, and her fingers tightened around the handle just a little. "That old ledger," she said. "Such a nuisance." "People make a drama out of anything." Miss Marple nodded, as though she agreed. She did not argue. She simply allowed the word nuisance to hang in the air. It did not smell like truth. As they spoke, Mrs. Phipps arrived with a bunch of winter flowers, bright and cheerful against the sober room. She did not come in the manner of a woman making a social call. She came in the manner of a woman arriving with news she could not keep in her pocket. "Miss Marple," she said warmly, "I knew you'd be here. It's all anyone can talk about. I can't remember the last time a book caused such commotion." Mrs. Linton made a small sound of impatience and asked if Mrs. Phipps would like tea. "Oh no," Mrs. Phipps replied, already settled into her topic. "I only stopped because I passed the vicarage, and Mrs. Partridge said the parish office is in a dreadful state this morning. Papers disturbed. A drawer left half open. She said she feels quite violated, poor soul." Mrs. Linton's teacup paused halfway to her lips. The maid's hand went to the sideboard again. Miss Marple's eyes rested for a moment on the maid's fingers. There was a faint redness on the tips, as though she had been scrubbing at something. It might have been from dishwater. It might have been from ink. Miss Marple simply noticed. "I'm sure it will be nothing," Mrs. Linton said quickly. "Somebody looking for an old hymn list, perhaps." Mrs. Phipps made a soft scoffing sound that was half amusement and half disbelief. "People don't rummage for hymn lists at dawn," she said. "Besides, Mrs. Partridge says the lock on the records cabinet was sticky. Someone's forced it." Mrs. Linton laughed again, that same bright laugh that ended too soon. She offered more jam. She offered more tea. She offered anything except attention to the words that had just been spoken. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her manner gentle, her voice warm. "Perhaps the parish office has simply been neglected," she said. "Old locks do become difficult, and in a village a locked door can seem like an invitation to curiosity." Mrs. Phipps looked at her with admiration, as though Miss Marple had said something wonderfully sensible. "Well," she said, lowering her voice, "I will tell you what I heard at the florist's this morning. Mrs. Haynes said her cousin once saw that ledger, years ago, and she swore there was a name inside it that should never be written down at all. Not if you want peace." Mrs. Linton's eyes flashed, sharp as a pin, then softened instantly. "People will say anything," she murmured. Miss Marple smiled kindly at both women as though gossip were simply another kind of weather, passing through. When Mrs. Phipps left, Mrs. Linton began speaking at once of unrelated things. The vicar's sermon. The state of the roses. A new curtain fabric she was considering. Miss Marple listened and let the words wash over her, while her mind quietly arranged what she had seen. Fear, she thought, often revealed itself not in what people said, but in what they worked so hard not to say. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the parish office under the pretext of returning a small donation envelope. She did it openly, in daylight, with a pleasant greeting for anyone she passed. The church stood calm and solid against the pale sky, its stones carrying the weight of generations of marriages, baptisms, funerals, and secrets. Inside, The air smelled of old paper and cold dust. Mrs. Partridge, the vicar's wife, was there with her sleeves rolled slightly, her hair pinned as if she had been fighting the room itself. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling between relief and indignation. "I am so glad you've come. It's dreadful. Simply dreadful. Someone has been in the records." Miss Marple murmured sympathy and accepted a cup of tea that tasted of nerves. She allowed Mrs. Partridge to lead her toward the cabinet, where folders and ledgers were stacked with a neatness that felt newly enforced. "I keep everything in order," Mrs. Partridge insisted. "I know exactly how it sits. And this morning I opened the drawer, and it was all wrong. Papers shifted. A ribbon marker moved. As though someone has been reading with dirty fingers." Miss Marple looked at the drawer. The lock did indeed look as though it had been forced, but only slightly, a careful hand not wishing to leave obvious damage. She bent as though to inspect it with poor eyesight, but her eyes were sharp. "Have you told the vicar?" she asked. Mrs. Partridge hesitated. "He says it's probably nothing," she said, and Miss Marple heard the wounded pride beneath the words. "He says people like village history. He says it is flattering. But he doesn't understand. It isn't history they want. Not really." Miss Marple nodded, as though the idea saddened her. "And what do you think they want?" she asked. Mrs. Partridge looked around as if the walls might overhear. "I think they want to change something," she whispered. "Or remove it. There are records here, Miss Marple. Donations, notes, little arrangements. People like to believe their lives are tidy. But paper remembers." Miss Marple's gaze moved to the parish register on the desk. It was open, as though Mrs. Partridge had been checking entries. The old ink and careful handwriting looked almost ceremonial. Miss Marple moved closer, her fingers hovering over the page without touching. "That is beautiful handwriting," she said softly. "It must take patience." Mrs. Partridge smiled faintly, pleased despite herself. "We try," she said. "We try to keep the record clean." Miss Marple leaned a little closer, as if admiring the neat lines. Then she saw it, a small tear near the inner margin. Not large, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The paper fibers were fresh where they had been pulled. Someone had removed something tucked into the binding. She said nothing at first. She simply continued admiring the register. Mrs. Partridge talked on about how careful she was, how impossible it was for things to go missing unless someone took them deliberately. Miss Marple listened, then asked in the most innocent tone, "Do you ever keep slips inside, Mrs. Partridge? Notes, perhaps, about special donations?" Mrs. Partridge stiffened. "Sometimes," she admitted reluctantly. "Just little things. Nothing important." Miss Marple looked again at the tear. It was too precise to be an accident. And it aligned, she thought, with the same kind of careful removal she had seen in the ledger. Not clumsy theft, not childish mischief. This was a hand that knew paper and respected it even while damaging it. As Miss Marple stood there, the vicar entered. He greeted her warmly and apologized for the fuss. He spoke in the soothing tones of a man determined to believe that moral order could be maintained by polite denial. "People grow excited," he said, smiling. "A village loves a mystery. It will pass." Miss Marple smiled back, the way she always did, kindly and without challenge. Yet she watched him as she spoke. When he mentioned the ledger, his eyes flicked toward the cabinet. When he mentioned the donation records, his voice tightened for the briefest moment. It was not guilt, Miss Marple thought. It was dread. The vicar feared scandal more than anything else, not because he had created it, but because he could not bear to see it. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she heard footsteps in the corridor and turned to see Evelyn Crane at the doorway, carrying a small basket of church linens, as though she had been placed there by fate itself. She smiled brightly. "Oh, Miss Marple," Evelyn said. "Mrs. Partridge asked me to drop these off. Isn't it a shame about the book? People can be so dramatic, can't they?" Miss Marple returned her smile with equal warmth. Dramatic, she agreed. Or frightened. Evelyn's smile flickered. Just for a second. Then it returned, smoother than before. Frightened of what? She asked, her tone light. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, as though considering. Of what paper might say, she replied gently. Evelyn laughed, but it was not quite natural. It came a fraction too late. Mrs. Partridge began fussing over the linens at once, as though determined to fill the room with harmless tasks. The vicar spoke of tea. Evelyn spoke of charity. Everyone spoke of anything except the register on the desk and the tear near its spine. Miss Marple walked home with the envelope still in her handbag, and the tear in the register clear in her mind. A missing page was one thing. A missing slip from the parish records was another. Together they formed a pattern. In the late afternoon, she stopped at the post office to collect stamps she did not truly need. The postmistress greeted her with that familiar village eagerness that always carried news disguised as complaint. Such a carry-on, the postmistress said. All over an old book. Still, I suppose it gives people something to talk about besides the price of butter. Miss Marple smiled and asked if business was steady. Oh, steady enough, the postmistress replied. Though I will say this, Miss Marple, people have been buying envelopes. More than usual. And sealing wax, too. I haven't sold sealing wax in ages, and suddenly I've sold 3 packets this week. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. How interesting, she said, and the postmistress leaned closer. I won't name names, she whispered, immediately naming them in the way village people did. But Miss Crane bought a packet yesterday, said she wanted to send something special. Isn't that odd for someone who's only been here such a short time? Miss Marple thanked her, bought her stamps, and walked on. By the time she reached her cottage, the sky had turned a soft gray. She made herself tea, arranged a biscuit on a plate, and sat by the window where she could watch the lane. Her mind moved calmly, like a hand smoothing fabric, a ledger with missing pages. Fresh gray dust in the seam. A parish register, with a small tear where something had been removed. A cabinet lock forced carefully. A newcomer smiling too brightly, a village speaking in pauses. When the evening light faded, Miss Marple allowed herself one quiet conclusion. Not spoken aloud. Not yet. Someone was not merely curious. Someone was editing the village. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly into the gathering dusk, knew she had just seen the first shadow of something dreadful. Chapter 3. The first sign that the matter had spread beyond polite concern came to Miss Marple in the form of an ink stain. It appeared on a cuff, and it appeared where it did not belong. She noticed it while standing in the mild chill of the village green, listening to 2 elderly gentlemen debate whether the frost had come earlier than usual this year. Neither gentleman mattered very much to her at that moment. The cuff did. Mr. Arkwright stood a little apart from the others near the low stone wall that bordered the green. He had retired some years earlier from his work as a solicitor, and now enjoyed a position of quiet authority. People still spoke of him as someone who knew things. He dressed carefully. His coat was brushed. His shoes were polished. That was why the dark smear of ink on his left cuff drew Miss Marple's eye at once. It was fresh. Too fresh for a man who claimed to have put down his pen years ago. She greeted him warmly and remarked on the crispness of the morning. He replied politely and at length on the subject of cold fingers and old bones. His voice was steady, his manner relaxed. Yet when Miss Marple casually asked whether he had attended the book sale, his words slowed just a little. Briefly, he said. Such events are rather lively for my taste. Miss Marple nodded as though she entirely agreed and let her gaze rest for a moment on the cuff. Mr. Arkwright noticed. He tugged at his sleeve at once. These old pens, he said with a small laugh. They leak when you least expect it. Miss Marple smiled and said nothing. She had already noticed that the ink stain sat not where a pen might brush accidentally, but where a page might be steadied while writing. It was the sort of mark made by someone leaning over paper late and with care. Later that morning, she called at his house under the excuse of returning a book he had lent her some weeks before. The house was neat and faintly austere. Papers were stacked precisely. The furniture bore no unnecessary ornaments. It was the home of a man who valued order above comfort. Mr. Arkwright invited her into the study where sunlight fell across a heavy desk. She noticed at once that a blotter lay open, and that the pen resting upon it was not decorative but well used. He followed her gaze and closed the blotter gently. "Old habits," he said lightly. "I find I still prefer writing things down." Miss Marple commented on the fine view from the window and allowed him to speak. He spoke of village matters, and then of the ledger. He mentioned it himself, which she found interesting. "It passed through my office once," he said, "many years ago, during a delicate matter involving church repairs and donations. Perfectly proper, of course." Of course, Miss Marple agreed. He spoke of it as though it were an inconvenience long resolved. Yet his fingers tapped once against the arm of his chair when he mentioned dates. Miss Marple watched the movement and listened without interruption. Outside the house, Mrs. Phipps passed with her basket of flowers. She waved cheerfully through the window and called out something about memorial stones needing attention. Mr. Arkwright's expression tightened at the word memorial, then smoothed itself away. "People would be surprised what names appear in records," he said. "Surprised and unsettled." Miss Marple said gently that history had a habit of returning whether invited or not. He smiled thinly. As she left, she noticed a small waste bin beside the desk. Inside were torn scraps of paper folded carefully before being discarded. She did not ask to see them. She did not need to. In the afternoon, Miss Marple walked past the churchyard and paused by the low wall where villagers often stopped to chat. Mrs. Phipps was there again, arranging small bunches of winter flowers near the stones. "Such a shame about the book," she said without prompting. "It stirred things up terribly. I heard Mrs. Linton snapped at her maid this morning. Quite unlike her." Miss Marple asked what the maid had done. "Oh, nothing at all," Mrs. Phipps replied. "That's what makes it odd. Just stood there. Sometimes guilt has nothing to do with wrongdoing. It's just fear." Miss Marple considered that and nodded. They spoke then of memorial inscriptions. Mrs. Phipps remarked that some names were engraved deeper than others, and wondered aloud if that was deliberate. "I always think," she said, "that people want certain names to last longer." Miss Marple smiled and agreed that stone remembered what people wished to forget. That evening, Peter Hargreaves called at Miss Marple's cottage. He looked pale and slightly agitated. He apologized for the intrusion, but said he felt she ought to know. He had received a note. He handed it to her with hands that shook despite his efforts to appear calm. The envelope was plain, the paper thick, the writing slanted oddly as though forced. Miss Marple read it slowly. It told him to stop looking. It suggested regret would follow if he did not. It did not threaten openly. It did not need to. She asked where it had come from. "It was left at my lodgings," he said. Slipped under the door. Miss Marple asked whether he had shown it to anyone else. "No," he said. "I thought of the vicar, but I didn't want to make trouble." Miss Marple said nothing of her thoughts. She studied the writing. The slant was unusual, the pressure uneven. It was the hand of someone disguising themselves, but not entirely succeeding. She thanked Peter and suggested he take care. She said it kindly and without alarm. After he left, she compared the handwriting in her mind to another she had seen that week. On a church donation card. On a linen inventory sheet. The same effortful tilt. The same hesitation before curves. The next morning, she went to the parish office again. This time, she did not announce her purpose at all. She stood quietly while Mrs. Partridge fussed with papers and spoke of how unsettled everyone seemed. "I do not like it," Mrs. Partridge said. "Secrets in a village feel heavier than in a town. They have nowhere to hide." Miss Marple agreed. While Mrs. Partridge fetched tea, Miss Marple allowed her eyes to wander. She noticed a thin line of gray paper dust near the cabinet hinge. Fresh, like that in the ledger. Like that which clung faintly to Evelyn Crane's glove. Evelyn Crane herself arrived shortly after bringing a basket of laundry as before. She smiled brightly and apologized for interrupting. She spoke of errands and goodwill and charity. Yet when Mrs. Partridge mentioned Peter Hargreaves, her tone shifted ever so slightly. Her words came a fraction too quickly. "He is very enthusiastic," Evelyn said. "Young men can be overeager." Miss Marple remarked mildly that enthusiasm often uncovered interesting things. Evelyn's smile tightened, then widened again. "I suppose so," she said. "But not everything needs uncovering." Miss Marple watched her fingers as she spoke. They were clean. Too clean. As though recently scrubbed. Later that day, Miss Marple walked to the edge of the village, where the old solicitor's path met the river. She did not expect to find anything. She simply wished to see who might cross her way. Mr. Arkwright appeared there unexpectedly and greeted her with forced cheer. He spoke of the weather. He spoke of the river. He did not mention the ledger. Miss Marple did not mention the ink. As they parted, he asked her gently whether she believed people could ever truly escape their past. Miss Marple replied that the past was patient. It waited. That night she sat by her fire and reviewed the day as she always did. An ink stain. A disguised note. Scraps of paper. A tear in a register. A newcomer eager to help. A village anxious to forget. She poured herself tea and smiled faintly. Someone was not merely frightened. Someone was taking steps. Careful steps. Legal steps. Paper steps. And Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that the next page would not go missing without consequence. Chapter 4. The invitation arrived on thick cream paper and was written in a hand that tried very hard to appear relaxed. Miss Marple noticed that at once. The words invited her to tea at the manor that afternoon, and spoke of nothing more pressing than neighborly sociability and the pleasure of conversation. Yet the ink pressed more heavily in certain places, as though the writer had paused there longer than intended. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and placed it beside her teacup. An invitation extended so promptly after a village disturbance was rarely about tea alone. The manor sat at the edge of St. Maron like a patient observer. Its windows had watched generations pass, and its walls had absorbed far more than laughter. Miss Marple arrived at precisely the time stated, and was shown into the drawing room where the fire burned low and steady. The furniture was arranged to suggest ease, though nothing here was accidental. Lady Harrow stood near the mantelpiece, arranging a tray with the deliberate calm of someone determined not to spill a single drop. Tea was poured. Cups were placed. The room filled with polite remarks about the weather and the pleasantness of company. Miss Marple listened and watched. When Sir Giles entered, he greeted her warmly and spoke at once of small matters as though to anchor the gathering in safety. Yet Miss Marple noticed that he did not sit down immediately. He lingered near a small escritoire and ran his hand across its surface before finally taking a chair. The talk turned as it inevitably did to the charity sale. Lady Harrow spoke lightly of the turnout and praised the organization. Sir Giles remarked that old books had a way of stirring sentiment. It was when someone mentioned the year of the ledger that Lady Harrow's tea tray shook once. Only once. She steadied it immediately and laughed at herself, but Miss Marple saw the movement clearly. It was not clumsiness. It was reaction. Miss Marple commented gently that old records could be quite fascinating. Lady Harrow agreed too quickly and began speaking of something else. The shift was smooth but unnecessary. That was what made it noticeable. As they spoke, a maid entered with fresh cakes. She moved quietly and efficiently, but Miss Marple saw her glance toward the door and then toward the shelves lining the far wall. They were handsome shelves, filled with books arranged by color rather than subject. Miss Marple found that interesting. Books arranged for appearance often hid absences well. A murmur of voices drifted in from the adjoining room, and Miss Marple recognized the bright tone at once. Evelyn Crane entered with an apologetic smile and explained she had been asked to drop off some documents for Sir Giles. She spoke cheerfully and thanked Lady Harrow for her kindness. Yet her eyes moved over the shelves with a precision that betrayed purpose. She was not admiring bindings. She was searching. Sir Giles took the papers from her and mentioned in passing that some old receipts had gone missing from his files. He said it as though it were an inconvenience no greater than a misplaced umbrella. Miss Marple noticed how Evelyn Crane's smile paused just a fraction too long. Receipts were discussed. Church repairs were mentioned. Miss Marple listened and made no contribution beyond nods and gentle agreement. She watched how Lady Harrow folded and unfolded her napkin. She noted how Sir Giles spoke of his late father, and how his voice softened, but also tightened, when he spoke of records kept in an unusual system. He said only one person had ever truly understood it. He did not say who that person was. Someone remarked that money always complicated memory. Miss Marple smiled at that and said nothing. The maid returned to clear the cups, and Miss Marple noticed a thin line of pale dust on the edge of the tray. It looked familiar. The maid wiped it away quickly with her thumb as though it embarrassed her. As the conversation drifted, Evelyn Crane excused herself and moved toward the bookshelf again under the pretense of straightening a fallen volume. Miss Marple watched her choose one book and then another. She did not open them. She pressed on the spines. She was checking thickness. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Lady Harrow invited Miss Marple to walk through the adjoining room where a small writing desk stood beneath a window. Miss Marple admired the view and remarked on the craftsmanship of the desk. Lady Harrow spoke of its history and mentioned that some drawers were locked for no reason other than habit. Miss Marple noticed faint scratches near the keyhole. Fresh ones. Sir Giles joined them and commented that people had been rather excitable of late. He said it with a tired smile. Miss Marple agreed and remarked that excitement often arose when people feared being misunderstood. Sir Giles laughed politely, but his eyes shifted toward the locked drawer. They returned to the drawing room where Mrs. Phipps had arrived bearing flowers. She spoke at once of village matters and mentioned casually that Mr. Linton had been seen arguing with someone near the churchyard the previous evening. Lady Harrow asked with whom, and Mrs. Phipps shrugged and said she could not be sure, but it looked serious. Sir Giles changed the subject. He spoke of the weather again. Miss Marple listened to the change and filed it away. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple noticed how Evelyn Crane grew restless. She checked the time more than once and glanced toward the hall. When she finally excused herself, she paused by Miss Marple and said how much she admired her calm in the face of village fuss. Her tone was pleasant, but carried an edge of inquiry. Miss Marple replied that fuss often settled itself when observed quietly. Evelyn smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. When Miss Marple finally rose to leave, Lady Harrow insisted on walking her to the door. At the threshold, she hesitated and then spoke softly. "People assume the past is finished," she said. "But it has a way of asking to be acknowledged." Miss Marple met her gaze kindly. "Yes," she said. "It does." Outside the manor, the air felt cooler. Miss Marple walked home along the lane, thinking not of what had been said, but of what had been avoided. Shaking trays, locked drawers, missing receipts, searching eyes. She stopped at the village shop where Mrs. Haynes was complaining loudly about shortages. Between complaints, she mentioned that Evelyn Crane had been buying extra gloves and cleaning supplies. Miss Marple thanked her for the information and purchased nothing she truly needed. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat by her window and watched the lights come on across the village. She thought of the ledger pages and the parish slip, and now the manor receipts. Different places, same care, same urgency. Someone was not merely erasing history. Someone was preparing for something else. Miss Marple poured herself tea and smiled gently into the gathering dusk. The tea tray had shaken. The drawer had been scratched. The shelves had been searched. And Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that whatever lay hidden at the heart of St. Maron was beginning to feel cornered. Chapter 5. The letter waited for Miss Marple at the garden gate, as though it had always belonged there. It lay neatly between the iron bars and the low stone post, protected from the morning damp by careful placement. Miss Marple noticed it at once, not because it was obvious, but because it was not. In St. Maron, messages left openly were usually either friendly notes or careless mistakes. This was neither. It had been positioned by someone who wished it to be found and not seen by anyone else. She paused before picking it up, glancing down the lane in both directions. The street was quiet. Mrs. Haynes's curtains twitched at the corner house, but that was nothing unusual. Miss Marple lifted the envelope and immediately noticed its weight and texture. The paper was thick, expensive, and faintly scented. Lavender, again. Not strong, just enough to linger. She carried it inside and placed it on the small table by the window, where the morning light fell kindly. Only then did she open it. The handwriting was careful to the point of strain. The letters leaned slightly to the right, but not naturally so. The pressure varied oddly, as though the writer had been forcing their hand into a shape it did not wish to make. Miss Marple read slowly, her expression unchanged. The message itself was polite. That was what made it unsettling. It asked Miss Marple to let the matter of the book rest. It suggested that old wounds did not benefit from reopening. It spoke of peace, of kindness, of the harm curiosity could cause. It did not threaten. It did not need to. Miss Marple folded the letter neatly and set it beside her teacup. She did not look troubled. She looked thoughtful. Lavender was not a village habit. Not anymore. People preferred sprays now. Modern conveniences. Lavender belonged to linen cupboards, to trunks, to places where things were stored away for long periods. It was the scent of preservation. Later that morning, she walked toward the post office with her usual measured pace. Along the way, she met Mrs. Phipps, who immediately launched into a commentary on the weather, and then just as quickly shifted to village matters. Such a shame about young Peter, Mrs. Phipps said. He looks so worn, running about with papers and questions. His landlady says he barely slept last night. Miss Marple murmured sympathy and asked whether the landlady had said why. Well, Mrs. Phipps replied, lowering her voice, he had visitors. Or at least letters. Someone pushed something under his door. Miss Marple nodded as though this were merely interesting rather than significant. At the post office, the bell rang cheerfully as she entered. The postmistress looked up with a knowing smile that suggested she had been waiting for someone to listen. Morning, Miss Marple, she said. I was just thinking about you. Funny how often that happens these days. Miss Marple asked after her health and purchased stamps she did not truly need. The postmistress leaned closer. I don't usually say such things, she said, immediately proving that she usually did, but someone's been posting letters without stamps. Hand-delivered. Thick paper. Smells nice, too. Lavender, if I'm not mistaken. Miss Marple looked politely surprised. Oh, yes. The postmistress continued. I saw one myself yesterday evening. The young clerk's door. And another earlier this week. Miss Crane was about. Said she was dropping off church notices. Miss Marple thanked her and left with a pleasant word. Outside, she paused long enough to reread the letter in her handbag without removing it. She did not need to see the words again. She was thinking about the effort it took to write so politely. That afternoon, she called at the edge of the village where Peter Hargreaves lodged. The house was narrow and smelled faintly of boiled vegetables. Peter answered the door looking thinner than before. I didn't want to trouble you, he said at once. You haven't, Miss Marple replied gently. You look as though you might benefit from tea. They sat in the small sitting room where everything had been arranged to appear orderly. Peter's papers were stacked neatly, but Miss Marple noticed how often his eyes drifted toward the door. She asked about his work, about the parish accounts, about the ledger. He answered readily enough until she mentioned letters. His expression changed. "I thought perhaps you had received one too," he said quietly. Miss Marple did not deny it. She asked whether he still had his. He hesitated, and then retrieved it from a drawer. The scent reached her before she even unfolded it. They compared the two letters without placing them side by side. Miss Marple did not wish to alarm him. She asked instead about the delivery. "It was under my door," Peter said. "Late. I heard footsteps, but by the time I opened it, there was no one." Miss Marple asked if he had noticed anything else unusual. Peter frowned. "There were scraps in the alley behind the parish office," he said. "I noticed them yesterday morning. I didn't think much of it at first, but now," Miss Marple asked him to show her. The alley was narrow and rarely used. The bins stood in a neat row. Peter pointed to the ground near the back wall. "I swept some of it away," he said apologetically. "But there were bits of paper. Not like letters. Thicker." Miss Marple crouched slightly and examined what remained. There were indeed scraps caught in the damp earth and pressed against the stone. She did not touch them at first. She studied the edges. They were clean cut, not torn. One scrap bore the faint trace of a printed line and the beginning of a number. Another had the ghost of a date. Miss Marple straightened and said nothing. That evening she returned home and placed the letter beside the scrap she had carefully wrapped in paper. She compared the texture, the weight, the faint gray dust that clung to the edges. Gray paper dust did not come from letters. It came from ledgers. Later, Mrs. Linton called unannounced, which in St. Maron was rarely accidental. She apologized profusely and spoke of loneliness and nerves. Miss Marple invited her in. Mrs. Linton spoke at length of how dreadful everything had become and how tired she felt. She insisted she knew nothing of the missing pages. Her voice wavered only once when Miss Marple mentioned lavender. "I can't stand the stuff," Mrs. Linton said too quickly. "Gives me headaches." Miss Marple nodded and offered her a biscuit. As Mrs. Linton stood to leave, Miss Marple noticed her handbag brush against the sideboard. Something inside shifted with a faint papery sound. Mrs. Linton froze, then laughed it off. "Too much clutter," she said. "I never throw anything away." Miss Marple smiled and watched her go. That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire and laid everything out in her mind. Letters delivered quietly. Lavender used not for pleasure but for disguise. Paper scraps hidden where few would look. Polite words masking urgency. Someone was not only erasing records. Someone was managing people. Miss Marple folded the letter once more and placed it carefully in her drawer. It had not frightened her. It had clarified something. When people asked for silence so earnestly, it was rarely because silence was harmless. And as the fire settled into embers, Miss Marple smiled kindly to herself, knowing that the missing pages had not been destroyed to forget the past, but to control the future. Chapter 6. The candles were already burning when Miss Marple arrived at the church hall that evening, and that in itself felt wrong. Meetings in St. Maron rarely required more than 1 or 2 lights at the front, and the reassuring glow of habit. Tonight there were several set along the walls, their flames steady but expectant, as though someone had anticipated trouble and prepared for it quietly. Miss Marple noticed this at once and said nothing. The committee gathered in polite clusters. Voices were low. Greetings were careful. Tea was poured with exaggerated gentleness. Miss Marple took her place near the end of the table where she could see everyone without appearing to watch. She noticed who sat beside whom and who chose to stand. She noticed who kept their coats on as though ready to leave. Sir Giles arrived late and apologized more than necessary. Mrs. Linton was already there, her hands folded in her lap, her smile fixed. Mr. Arkwright sat stiffly with his papers aligned exactly. Evelyn Crane moved easily between chairs, offering help, adjusting a candle, collecting empty cups. She was busy in the way people were busy when they wished to be indispensable. The meeting began with routine matters. Accounts were mentioned. Repairs were discussed. Miss Marple listened and watched. Each time Peter Hargreaves' name came up, she observed a ripple move through the room. It was subtle, a shift of posture, a tightening of shoulders, a glance toward the door. Peter himself arrived just as the vicar began speaking about transparency and trust. He apologized quietly for being late and took a seat near the wall. Miss Marple noted that he looked tired but determined. His eyes moved from face to face as though assembling a picture that would not quite come together. The candles flickered as the wind pressed briefly against the windows. Miss Marple felt the room draw inward, each person retreating slightly into themselves. The vicar suggested that the ledger matter be handled discreetly to avoid distress. Miss Marple heard Mrs. Linton exhale sharply before catching herself. Someone mentioned the partial date that had been found on the paper scrap. It was said carefully, almost reluctantly. The effect was immediate. Mr. Arkwright's jaw tightened. Evelyn Crane leaned forward, her expression attentive to the point of strain. Miss Marple watched Evelyn closely then. She noticed how her hand hovered near her handbag as though checking its presence. She noticed how she glanced toward the side door behind the vestry, a door rarely used during meetings. The lights went out without warning. It was not dramatic. There was no crash or cry. Just a soft collective intake of breath as the electric lamps failed, and the room was left to candlelight alone. The flames wavered. Shadows leapt. Voices rose in brief startled murmurs, and then fell again into embarrassed laughter. "How silly," someone said. "Must be the wind." The vicar moved to reassure everyone, and suggested continuing. Miss Marple remained still. In the uneven light, she watched Evelyn Crane stand. She moved smoothly, apologizing under her breath, and slipped toward the side door. Miss Marple did not follow. She did not need to. She had already seen what mattered. Evelyn had not looked startled by the darkness. She had been ready. The meeting resumed with forced calm. Sir Giles spoke of patience. Mrs. Linton nodded too vigorously. Mr. Arkwright said nothing at all. Miss Marple noticed how Peter kept glancing toward the side door. His brow furrowed. When the lights finally returned, there was a sense of relief too strong for the cause. People laughed again, this time with effort. Evelyn Crane returned to her seat with an apologetic smile and spoke of checking the fuse box. "You're very resourceful," Mrs. Linton said a little too warmly. Evelyn smiled. "One does what one can." The meeting ended soon after. People left quickly, their politeness fraying at the edges. Miss Marple lingered only long enough to thank the vicar, and then stepped outside into the cool night air. She did not go home at once. Instead, she walked along the path that ran behind the church toward the river, the one seldom used after dark. The moon was thin, but sufficient. She moved carefully, her shoes making little sound on the damp ground. Halfway along the path, she saw it. A scuffed patch of mud near the hedge, darker than the rest, as though disturbed recently. Miss Marple bent slightly and examined it. The marks were confused. Not the neat impressions of passing feet, but the churned ground of sudden movement. A heel had slipped. A hand had pressed against the earth. She straightened slowly. Nearby, a broken twig lay against the hedge. A thread caught on a thorn fluttered faintly in the breeze. Miss Marple leaned closer. The thread was pale and smelled faintly of lavender. She closed her eyes briefly. The next morning, the village woke to a different sort of quiet. It was the quiet that followed news no one wished to speak aloud. Peter Hargreaves had not returned to his lodgings. His landlady had waited until breakfast time before raising alarm, telling herself he must have stayed with a friend. By mid-morning, even she could no longer pretend. Miss Marple heard it from Mrs. Phipps, who arrived breathless at her door with worry shining in her eyes. "He never came home," she said. "And his papers are still on his desk. All of them." Miss Marple asked calmly when Peter had last been seen. At the meeting, Mrs. Phipps replied, "And later, perhaps, walking toward the river path. Mrs. Linton said she heard footsteps near her pantry window late last night. Miss Marple thanked her and put on her coat. She walked first to the parish office. The door stood unlocked. Inside, everything looked too tidy. Peter's notes lay stacked as though deliberately arranged. Miss Marple noticed that the top sheet had been smoothed carefully, its corners aligned. Someone had wanted it to appear untouched. She lifted the page slightly and saw beneath it a faint smudge of gray dust. At the back of the building, the bins stood as before. Miss Marple checked them quickly. Nothing obvious. Whoever had taken Peter had not been careless here. She walked next to Mrs. Linton's house and paused near the pantry window. The grass beneath it was flattened in a narrow strip, as though someone had stood there listening. Miss Marple bent and examined the sill. There was a faint scratch along the paintwork. Fresh. Mrs. Linton answered the door herself, looking pale and exhausted. "I hardly slept," she said at once. "Such noises in the night. Footsteps. I thought perhaps it was the wind." Miss Marple asked gently whether Mrs. Linton had seen anyone. "No," Mrs. Linton said too quickly. "I didn't look." Miss Marple nodded as though that were entirely reasonable. She continued toward the river path, where villagers were beginning to gather. They stood in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Sir Giles was there, his face grave. Mr. Arkwright stood apart, his hands clasped behind his back. Evelyn Crane was not yet present. Miss Marple moved to the scuffed patch of ground she had seen the night before. In daylight, it was even clearer. Someone had stumbled. Someone else had pulled. A small piece of paper lay half buried near the hedge. Miss Marple retrieved it carefully. It was the corner of a letter. Thick paper. Lavender-scented. The edge was torn, not cut. She folded it and placed it in her handbag. By the time Evelyn Crane arrived, the village had settled into a brittle calm. She expressed concern. She offered help. She spoke of organizing searches and comforting Peter's landlady. Her words were all correct. Miss Marple watched her eyes. They moved constantly. Not with fear, but with calculation. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple felt the pattern settle into place. The letters. The scraps. The scuffed ground. The careful tidying of Peter's papers. The use of darkness not to hide, but to move. She returned home briefly to make tea and consider. She did not hurry. Panic was never helpful. Peter had not been taken far. Whoever had done it wanted him silent, not vanished. They wanted time. Miss Marple finished her tea and stood. By the time she stepped back into the lane, the village had begun to search in earnest. Voices called softly across fields. Doors were knocked. Miss Marple joined them briefly, then slipped away toward the old storage sheds near the edge of the church grounds, long unused and rarely checked. As she walked, she thought of Evelyn's readiness when the lights went out. She thought of the lavender thread caught on the thorn. She thought of paper dust and careful hands. She reached the sheds and paused. One door stood slightly ajar. Too slightly, as though someone had meant it to look closed. Miss Marple did not open it yet. She smiled gently, sadly, into the quiet afternoon. The candles had gone out. The darkness had been used, and somewhere very close, she knew, the truth was waiting to be let back into the light. Chapter 7. The page returned in the early morning, like a thing that wished to be found but not claimed. It lay on the stone step of the church, wrapped in plain brown paper tied with string that had been knotted carefully, and then pulled too tight, as though the person who tied it had been afraid their hands might shake. Miss Marple heard of it before she saw it. In St. Maron, news traveled ahead of objects, softening them with speculation before they were touched. Mrs. Partridge arrived at Miss Marple's door just after breakfast, with the parcel cradled as though it were fragile. Her face held the look of someone who had not slept well, and had not wished to explain why. "It was there when I unlocked the church," she said, "just sitting there. As neat as you please." Miss Marple invited her in and made tea. She did not open the parcel at once. She let it rest on the table between them, and watched Mrs. Partridge's eyes return to it again and again. "They want it seen," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Partridge nodded. "That's what frightens me." When the string was finally untied and the paper unfolded, the scent of lavender rose faintly and then settled. Inside lay a single ledger page, yellowed with age but unmistakable in its texture and ink. Miss Marple did not read it aloud. She read it silently, her face calm, her eyes attentive. The page recorded a private arrangement disguised as generosity, a sum transferred through a church fund during a year of difficulty, a name signed with confidence, and a flourish that suggested pride rather than secrecy. It was not a criminal record. It was something worse. It was proof of moral compromise wrapped in respectability. Mrs. Partridge pressed her hands together. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew it would be something like this." Miss Marple folded the page carefully and slipped it back into the paper. "They brought it back," she said, "because they have realized something." Mrs. Partridge looked at her. "That destroying records does not destroy memory," Miss Marple continued. "And that silence is only useful if everyone agrees to keep it." By mid-morning, the village had gathered in cautious clusters near the church. People did not crowd the steps. They lingered just far enough away to claim they were merely passing. Miss Marple moved among them with gentle greetings and quiet remarks. She listened. Mrs. Haynes spoke of fear. Mrs. Phipps spoke of shame. Someone else spoke of the old days and how much easier they seemed in hindsight. Miss Marple heard in their words a shared realization that whatever had been hidden was no longer safely buried. Sir Giles arrived looking older than before. He spoke briefly with the vicar, and then stood apart, his gaze fixed on the door. Mr. Arkwright was there too, his expression set, his cuff today spotless. He spoke to no one. Evelyn Crane arrived last. She moved with purpose, her concern carefully displayed. She asked after Peter at once and offered to organize food for the searchers. She spoke of responsibility and kindness and the need to stand together. Miss Marple noticed that she did not ask what had been found on the church steps. When Miss Marple mentioned the returned page, Evelyn's smile faltered. Only slightly, only long enough for Miss Marple to see it. "Oh," Evelyn said. "How strange." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Strange is one word for it." The search resumed with more urgency now. Villagers fanned out across familiar ground, calling Peter's name with careful optimism. Miss Marple joined briefly, then slipped away toward the manor. She had been thinking not of where Peter might be, but of where someone would choose to hide him. The manor stood quiet in the late morning light. Miss Marple was admitted by the maid, who looked relieved to see her. Inside, the house felt watchful. Miss Marple asked after Sir Giles and was told he was out. She asked instead if she might look at the old writing desk again. The maid hesitated, then agreed. The drawer was still locked. Miss Marple examined it closely. The scratches near the keyhole were more obvious now that she knew to look for them. Someone had tried repeatedly and carefully to open it without drawing attention. Miss Marple did not force it. She stepped back and looked at the shelves nearby. One book was slightly misaligned. She removed it and found behind it a folded envelope. Inside were receipts and notes written in the same careful hand as the returned ledger page. Miss Marple did not need to read them all. She read enough. She replaced everything exactly as she had found it, and left the manor without comment. Outside, she encountered Sir Giles returning along the drive. He greeted her politely but stiffly. "I was just paying my respects at the church," he said. Miss Marple nodded. Of course, they walked together for a short distance. Miss Marple remarked on the difficulty of inheritance. Sir Giles responded cautiously. When she mentioned records and the burden of old obligations, he stopped walking. I did not ask for my father's choices, he said. No, Miss Marple agreed. But you have carried them. He looked at her sharply, then away. People are frightened, he said. They fear scandal more than wrongdoing. Miss Marple smiled gently. Fear makes people careless, she said. He said nothing more. By afternoon, the return page had been quietly locked away. The village spoke of it in lowered voices, as though it might hear them. Miss Marple returned home briefly to gather her thoughts. She laid the patterns out as she always did, not on paper but in her mind. The ledger pages cut with care. The parish slip removed. The manor receipts hidden. The polite letters scented with lavender. The darkness at the meeting used to move rather than conceal. The scuffed ground near the hedge. The storage sheds. Peter had been taken to silence him temporarily, not to harm him. Whoever had done it needed time to decide what to do next. Time was running out. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to the church grounds. The searchers were tired now, their voices hoarse. Evelyn Crane moved among them, offering encouragement. She carried a basket of food and spoke of hope. Miss Marple watched her carefully. When the vicar suggested checking the old storage sheds near the edge of the grounds, Evelyn agreed at once. Too quickly. Miss Marple saw the eagerness flash across her face before being smoothed away. They walked together toward the sheds. Miss Marple allowed others to go ahead. She stayed just behind Evelyn. You have been very helpful, Miss Marple said kindly. Evelyn smiled. I believe in doing one's part. Do you? Miss Marple said softly. They reached the sheds. The doors were weathered, the locks rusted. One door stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple stepped forward. Perhaps we should begin here, she said. Evelyn's hand tightened around her basket handle. Someone opened the door. Inside, the air was stale and cold. And there, sitting on a crate with his hands bound but his posture defiant, was Peter Hargreaves. There was a cry of relief. Voices rushed in. Peter was freed at once and surrounded. He was shaken but unharmed. Miss Marple watched Evelyn Crane as the moment unfolded. She did not rush forward. She did not cry out. She stood very still. You look disappointed, Miss Marple said quietly. Evelyn turned, startled. Of course not, she said quickly. I'm relieved. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Relief is usually louder, she said. Peter spoke then, his voice hoarse but clear. He said someone had lured him away after the meeting under the pretense of showing him more paper scraps. He said he had been locked in and told to be quiet. He said the person had spoken of fairness and debts and things owed. Miss Marple looked at Evelyn. The handwriting, she said gently. The lavender. The careful cuts. The effort to control the story rather than destroy it. Evelyn's face changed then. Not into panic, into anger. They owed my father, she said sharply. They took his name and buried it. I only wanted the truth. Miss Marple nodded. And you nearly buried another person instead. Silence fell. Miss Marple looked around at the villagers, her voice calm, warm, unwavering. Truth does not belong to those who seize it, she said. It belongs to those who can bear it. Evelyn's shoulders slumped. The fight went out of her. As the villagers led Peter away, and the vicar spoke of calling for proper authorities, Miss Marple remained where she was, watching the dusk settle over the churchyard. The page had returned. The truth had followed. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly into the quiet evening, knew that the last shadow was finally ready to be faced. Chapter 8. The church hall felt different when everyone gathered again that evening. It was not fuller than before, nor louder, yet the air carried a weight that had nothing to do with numbers. People took their seats with care, as though each chair held a memory that might protest if disturbed. Miss Marple noticed who chose the back rows and who sat near the front. She noticed who folded their hands and who kept them clenched in their laps. The village had come not for tea or polite discussion, but for an ending. Miss Marple stood near the long table where the ledger lay wrapped once more in brown paper. She did not place herself at the center. She never did. Instead, she stood slightly to one side, allowing others to feel that they were part of what was about to happen, not merely witnesses to it. The vicar cleared his throat and spoke briefly about concern, relief, and gratitude that Peter Hargreaves had been found unharmed. There were murmurs of agreement. Peter sat near the front, pale but upright, his eyes moving restlessly through the room. When his gaze met Miss Marple's, she gave him the smallest nod. It steadied him more than any words could have done. Sir Giles sat stiffly, his hands folded together as though he were holding something invisible and heavy. Mrs. Linton sat 2 rows behind him, her posture perfect, her expression strained into something resembling calm. Mr. Arkwright sat alone, his face carefully composed, his eyes lowered. Evelyn Crane sat near the aisle. She had chosen a place that allowed for movement, Miss Marple noted. Old habits. The vicar gestured toward Miss Marple. Perhaps, he said gently, you would like to speak. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as though surprised by the suggestion. She stepped forward and rested her hands lightly on the edge of the table. It is a comfort, she began, to live in a place where people greet one another by name and notice when something is out of order. It is also a danger. She let the words settle. No one interrupted. In a village, she continued, we learn to arrange our lives carefully. We speak politely. We avoid what might cause discomfort. Over time, these habits can begin to feel like virtue. But politeness is not the same thing as honesty. A faint stir moved through the room. Miss Marple reached for the wrapped ledger and unfolded it with deliberate slowness. The scent of old paper rose softly. She did not open the book at once. This book, she said, was never dangerous because of what it contained. It was dangerous because of what people believed it could reveal. She spoke of the charity sale and the careful hands that had touched the ledger too often. She spoke of the gray dust in its seam, the sign of pages removed recently and with care. She spoke of the parish register and the small tear where a slip had once been hidden. Each detail was offered gently, without accusation, like pieces of embroidery laid out for admiration. She spoke of the manor receipts, the locked drawer, the searching eyes that lingered on bookshelves not for reading, but for measurement. She spoke of letters delivered quietly, scented with lavender, written politely yet urgently, asking for silence in the name of peace. As she spoke, Miss Marple watched the room. She saw Sir Giles' shoulders sink slightly. She saw Mrs. Linton press her lips together. She saw Mr. Arkwright's jaw tighten and then relax. And she saw Evelyn Crane sit very still. Then, Miss Marple said, there was the darkness. She described the meeting, the sudden failure of lights, the candles already placed as though anticipated. She described how one person had not been startled, how that person had used the moment to move unseen. Peter shifted in his seat. Miss Marple spoke next of the scuffed ground by the river path, the broken twig, the lavender-scented thread caught on a thorn. She spoke of the careful tidying of Peter's papers, the attempt to make absence look like order. The intention, she said softly, was never harm. It was delay. She turned then and faced Evelyn Crane. Delay, she repeated, so that a decision could be made. Evelyn did not look away. Her face was pale, but composed. Miss Marple lifted the returned ledger page and held it up so that those nearest could see it. This page, she said, records a private arrangement made long ago. Money passed through charitable hands to preserve a reputation. It was not illegal. It was discreet. And it worked. A murmur moved through the room. Sir Giles closed his eyes briefly. The arrangement involved a man who later fell from favor. Miss Marple continued. His name was allowed to fade while others continued on, respected and secure. His child grew up knowing only that something had been taken and hidden behind good manners. She looked again at Evelyn. You came to St. Maron believing that paper held power. You believed that if you could control the record, you could correct the balance. Evelyn's voice came out sharp and clear. They ruined him, she said. They buried him in silence. I only wanted the truth. Miss Marple nodded. You wanted justice, she said. But justice does not come from erasure. It comes from acknowledgement. Evelyn laughed once, bitterly. And you think they would have acknowledged it? They were perfectly happy to pretend none of it happened. Miss Marple did not argue. I think, she said, that you underestimated one thing. Evelyn frowned. What is that? The village, Miss Marple replied gently. She gestured toward the people seated around them. In places like this, she said, secrets do not vanish. They soften. They change shape. They pass from person to person until no one remembers where they began. But everyone remembers how they feel. She turned then to Sir Giles. You carried your father's burden, she said kindly, not because you agreed with it, but because you feared what would happen if it were spoken aloud. Sir Giles stood slowly. I was wrong, he said hoarsely. I thought keeping silent was protecting everyone. Miss Marple nodded. Silence protects no one, she said. It only delays harm. She turned next to Mr. Arkwright. You advised discretion, she said. You drafted documents that made things neat. You believed order was kindness. Mr. Arkwright lifted his head. I believed scandal would destroy the village, he said. Scandal fades, Miss Marple replied. Truth remains. Finally, she looked to Mrs. Linton. You were afraid, she said softly. Afraid of being connected. Afraid of being judged. Fear makes people watch rather than act. Mrs. Linton began to cry quietly, her perfect posture finally breaking. Miss Marple returned her attention to Evelyn. You cut pages, she said. You removed slips. You wrote letters. You locked a young man in a shed and told yourself it was temporary. You believed you were correcting a wrong. Evelyn's shoulders sagged. I did not mean to hurt him, she said. I only needed time. Time, Miss Marple said gently, has a way of turning intention into consequence. There was a long silence. Peter stood then, unsteadily. She told me, he said, his voice trembling but determined. She said if I stopped asking questions, everything would settle. She said the truth would only cause pain. Miss Marple looked at him with quiet approval. And did you believe her? She asked. Peter shook his head. No, he said. Because it already hurt. The vicar cleared his throat and spoke of responsibility and the need to proceed properly from here. People nodded. Some looked relieved. Others looked ashamed. Evelyn Crane did not resist when she was gently asked to step aside. The fight had left her. What remained was exhaustion. As people began to leave the hall, Miss Marple stayed behind for a moment. She rewrapped the ledger page and placed it carefully back inside the book. She smoothed the paper with the same care that had once been used to cut it. Sir Giles approached her quietly. I will make it right, he said, as much as one can. Miss Marple smiled kindly. That is all anyone can do, she replied. Outside, the evening had settled into a calm that felt earned rather than forced. The lights in the village windows glowed softly. Voices carried without urgency. The church bell marked the hour without ceremony. Miss Marple walked home at her usual pace, her mind already releasing its hold on the matter. The village would talk. It would judge. It would heal. It always did, in its own slow way. At her gate she paused and looked back once more toward the church. The book with missing pages had been restored not by glue or thread, but by truth spoken aloud. Miss Marple opened her door, set the kettle on, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The story had ended where it should, with the truth placed back where it belonged.